All right, hey, how we doing, guys? So today, kind of staying on some basic battle tactics, and this one is actually not basic at all, but we're going to talk about an attack in oblique order. So conceptually, this one's extremely simple, which is basically that we are going to overload one of the flanks of our attacking force, or you could say that we are going to purposely weaken one of the flanks of our attacking force in order to force an overload on the other flank. So for example, if I have my, opposing forces lined up, so we overload one flank. Obviously the idea then is if this flank that's weakened can either A, hold its own enough to draw the attention that it needs to draw and to keep an enemy pinned and occupied while the powerful flank drives its way through. That can be a way to instigate a turning action or to open a flank and then instigate what historically we typically call like a hammer and anvil. Or this weakened flank can be more of a purposeful distraction. And so what I've talked about this in my videos, which is as you get away from like a very small like handful of like tactics, a lot of other, battle tactics, strategies, whatever you want to call them, they tend to get like fairly derivative, but there are some small details. So this, we can kind of talk about, we go back to some of like one of the first videos I made where we talked about like finding, fixing, flanking, finishing. And then even when I've talked about like the idea of echelon attacks or progressive attacks, parallel attacks, that sort of stuff, which would be more like, hey, this flank, the weakened flank is more of a fixing force, i.e. what we can't have happen is for us to obviously overload one wing of our army for this enemy commander to go, oh man, it sure seems like this side is weak and this side strong. What if I were just to do, and then pull a couple guys down there, and then now all of a sudden like, hey, that doesn't really work anymore. So these forces have to occupy that flank, whether through distraction, feinting, subterfuge, faking it, or through being competent enough that a smaller force that is either more well equipped or more disciplined can make that happen. So that's kind of the nutshell way to think about an attack in oblique order. Now, how this tends to manifest itself more in reality, and there's a reason why you don't really hear about this in any sort of modern sense, once you kind of get into the gunpowder, once you get out of the gunpowder era and into the modern era, like the late 19th century and afterwards. It's just because one, firepower has gotten so great, but the distances at which firepower can be brought has massively increased. And the same thing with observation. So the person that is most known for using attack in oblique order is Frederick the Great. Obviously, famous Prussian, ruler, came to power in 1740. And then the decade of like the 1740s and then till the end of the 1750s is when Prussia under Frederick the Great was in its heyday. Battle of Leuthen, Rossbach, places like that. So the Prussian method of doing this required insane amounts of discipline. And Napoleon himself said that only the Prussians were capable of an attack in oblique order because, let me see if I can set this up quick enough. But so the attack in oblique order would come from column of march, the way that Frederick would set it up, right? Because obviously, if you're just going to march everything out in a pitched battle, i.e. a battle where both sides choose to be there, you're going to set yourself up, he's going to set himself up, and then he looks over and goes, man, sure seems like he has all of his dudes on the right side, I better put some people over there, right? So there has to be some form of distraction, some form of, hiding or in some way masking what you are doing from the enemy. So what the Prussian method tended to be was one, a very long march, starting like early in the morning or kind of, at night in order to get there immediately. And then the Prussians marched in step to cadence and extremely close order, which is very difficult to do in any sense of the word, let alone over like actual terrain. And then they had to be able to attack out of column and immediately go from attacking in line to column so they could facilitate the movement. And what I mean by that is if we imagine we have our column coming up and we intend to oblique order and attack what would be our right flank here. So obviously we have to in some way engage the enemy first with our weakened flank, but get him to either A, keep troops pinned there, or move other troops there so our stronger flank can then attack them. So what this would tend to be for the Prussians would be something to the extent of an attack along this flank, and then possibly even a feigned retreat or a real retreat. While this attack was going on, the Prussians would utilize terrain. So if you imagine that we have, let's say, like low ridge, hills, woods, something to that extent that could obscure vision, while this attack was going on, the remainder of the column would make a forced march at speed on to cadence to immediately show up on the enemy's other flank and overwhelm them. So this was done famously, Frederick the Great's most famous battle, the Battle of Leuthen, 1757, was where he did this against the Austrians to actual complete perfection. And it was something to this extent where what this tended to be more, and maybe this would be something I talk about there, but where this attack here took place, the Prussians attacked, nothing really happened. They kind of withdrew, left forces around there. Meanwhile, this force made a forced march and ended up on hills at a right angle to the Austrian line, then attacked down into them. The Austrians, again, why this succeeded is the Austrians failed to do even a single simple patrol to discover the Prussians that were behind the hills over here moving. So they remained fixated on the Prussians that were on their right flank, not knowing that there was a larger attack coming. And by the time they did, and by the time they reset and moved troops, it was too late. They were engaged with Prussians that they could compete with relatively well on numbers and equipment, but the Prussians were on higher ground with artillery. So again, attack in oblique order, the basics of it very simple, is just that, hey, you got everyone lined up, you make one flank significantly more powerful, whether due to numbers or due to equipment. In the modern sense, you could think of this like, hey, let's say I have a 6th division attacking force. 2 of those divisions are armored cavalry divisions. So I could have 4 divisions attacking, and then my right wing could be a very highly compressed double, armored cavalry division attack against the enemy. So I could overload that one wing, not necessarily with numbers per se, but with equipment. You could also do this with experience. So you could say, hey, I could have my least experienced, my militia, my least reliable troops on one flank. My best units could be on another flank with the intention of overwhelming the enemy there. Now, last thing I'll talk about with this is just the dangers of it. So obviously the dangers of overloading one wing is that, one, if an enemy discovers it and they can crush your weakened flank before you can crush them with your stronger flank, they could turn your own army's flank when it comes to that. It also means that if they're able to stifle or to hold your strongest wing in place, they can then shift units to attack your weakened flank. So you have to succeed, because the oblique order attack, at least in its classical and its Napoleonic context, tends to also indicate a full commitment to the battle. But that's all I got. Attack in oblique order, basic battle tactics, guys.